my name is Joanna Morales, and I'm a cancer rights attorney. Most people aren't familiar with the area of cancer rights law because it covers areas of the law that people don't think of as legal issues, like accessing health insurance coverage, navigating employment issues, being able to take time off work, and accessing government programs and benefits. It's so important that people understand their rights and their options available to them so they can find their best path forward that I co-founded an organization called Triage Cancer to help people navigate those issues.
My name is Monica Bryant. I am a cancer rights attorney. And with that job, I have the privilege of providing individuals information about the law in an understandable manner that can change their lives. Lots of people don't realize that there are so many legal aspects about cancer, but it turns out that successfully navigating a cancer diagnosis can often be rooted in understanding their health insurance options, their employment rights, their financial options, and so much more that goes into cancer rights law. So I was delighted to co-found an organization named Triage Cancer that exists to ensure that those who are diagnosed with cancer and their caregivers have access to the best resources needed to make the best decisions for them.
Hello, and welcome to Cancer Convos. I'm Lindsay Half. I'm the Senior Policy Manager at NCCS, and I am delighted today to get to talk with Monica Bryant and Joanna Morales, the two women behind Triage Cancer, a national nonprofit organization that provides education on practical and legal issues that impact individuals diagnosed with cancer. So at NCCS, we know what an incredible burden finances and insurance often pose to those living with cancer. And I suspect that if you're listening to this podcast, you probably know it all too well also. And I've had the pleasure of working with Triage Cancer on several projects and initiatives over the years. And, our missions sort of overlap in that a lot of the work that we do is focused on just making sure patients and their families have the information they need to make the best decisions for themselves and to have a clear path forward. So I'm really excited to talk with these two ladies today to hear more about how they got into this work and what it's like working in the cancer rights world during this uncertain and crazy time of COVID-19. So hello, Monica and Joanna. Like I mentioned, we've worked together several years now, and I'm embarrassed. Like I still don't know the real story behind how you guys started Triage Cancer. I think it's so cool that your sisters doing this incredible work together. I'd love to hear the background. So, Joanna, can you take us back to the beginning and tell us how y'all got started in this work?
Well, that is a long answer, but we are happy to share it with you because it really does speak to why we do this work. When I was in law school, I was also working at a cancer center in Southern California. And one of my responsibilities at that cancer center was actually to fit patients for mastectomy bras and prostheses after a breast cancer diagnosis and surgery. And I learned a lot, obviously, about living with a cancer diagnosis. But I also learned a lot about insurance coverage because I then needed to bill insurance for those mastectomy bras and prostheses. And often I would find out that they would get denied by insurance coverage, even though there was a federal law that required those insurance companies to pay for those mastectomy bras and prostheses. And I only knew that because I happened to be in law school at the time and in the only class in the country on cancer rights law. And I learned about the Women's Health and Cancer Rights Act. And so I would call up the insurance companies and say, I don't understand why this was denied. It should be covered under your policy. And they would just say, it's not covered. It's cosmetic. We're not paying for it. And then I would say, well, what about WICRA? And then they would immediately change their mind and say, okay, we'll pay for it. And it was such an eye-opening experience for me that if you don't know what your rights are, often our systems will walk all over you. And so it really was a social justice issue for me to make sure that people understand what their rights are. And you shouldn't have to go to law school to know what your rights are. And that's ultimately what drove me to continue to do this work and ultimately to found Triage Cancer with Monica. So I'll let Monica talk a little bit about what brought her to this experience.
Thanks, Joanna. As long as I can remember, I've had an interest in how the law has the ability to both oppress and empower people. And I think that perhaps unbeknownst to many Americans, the law actually touches almost every aspect of our lives, but that as individuals, we have the power to use the law as a tool to be our own best advocate. And so after I left my job working for a congresswoman in DC, I was really struggling to find a career where I could use my knowledge of the law and the legislative process, as well as my desire to help people find their voices. And so the stars really aligned, and Joanna and I had this idea of how we could team up our efforts and work together in making sure that we could provide individuals with sometimes even the most basic information about the law, but do it in a really understandable, actionable way, and how that can change their lives. And I think over the years of doing this, we've watched people go from complete despair over what might be the seemingly unavoidable financial devastation to elation, finding out that, they can appeal that insurance company's claim denial, or that they have rights and tools to be able to stay at work so they can maintain their health insurance. And so sometimes it's just about being able to provide people with the tools so that they can then turn around and make the best decisions for them. And I think that's what I feel very lucky to be able to do every single day at Triage Cancer.
Wow, I love that. And I love that both of you, you're the catalyst for getting into this world of cancer law and rights is just really wanting to help people find their voices. You shouldn't have to have a law degree to be able to navigate this complex healthcare system and insurance system and, just to get the care that they deserve and that they need. Thank you so much for sharing that. So it sounds like, you guys have been really boots on the ground in this work for a while now. I think a lot of attorneys sit behind mahogany desks with shelves full of many leather-bound books. I just want to sound like Ron Burgundy for a minute. But seriously, it was really, really cool to see you guys in action when I attended one of your trainings in West Virginia a couple years ago. It was neat to see a room full of not just cancer survivors, but there were social workers and nurses and doctors and insurance people. And it was just like everybody, all the stakeholders there, and you guys were just giving them such useful information. And I want to hear more about, what kind of things that your trainings cover and what of the other things that you guys focus on in your work. Monica, do you want to tackle that one?
Sure. So we actually host a couple of different trainings. The one that you attended was one of our conferences, and we host 3 of those a year pre-COVID at different locations around the year. We've obviously pivoted to hosting them virtually this year. But those conferences are open to individuals who have been diagnosed, caregivers, advocates, healthcare professionals, really anyone who is interested in learning more about this area of the law. And we cover topics like understanding your health insurance options and navigating those health insurance policies, because getting the health insurance is only half the battle. Employment rights. So what options do people have to continue to work through treatment or to take time off? And if they do need to take time off, how do they pay for that? We talk about advocacy. We talk about estate planning. And really, the way I look at those conferences is it's an introduction in many cases for people to this area of cancer rights. And then we're constantly trying to provide them with additional resources and other places that they can go, both on our website at triagecancer.org, but also on our complimentary website that we host, which is cancerfinances.org. And on that website, we really try to talk about all of the topics that relate to somebody's financial situation. So health insurance, employment, clinical trials access, education rights. And the way that that website is set up is that people can answer questions posed to them by the site, and then based on their answers, it takes them to targeted information. So the trainings are really just step one in a lot of situations, and we always end our trainings with, we hope there's a continued relationship with Triage Cancer, because more often than not, someone comes with one question about one topic and then finds out, oh, there's all these other questions maybe I should be asking.
Right. And speaking of questions, that patients and their care teams should be asking or be aware of, I'm curious, what is the most common question that you get from cancer survivors? And then I guess it'd be interesting to hear what the common question or concern would be from the care team. Joanna, do you want to tackle that one?
Sure. I think it's really some of the things that Monica talked about. I don't know that I could say there's one question that rises to the top of the list, but I would say that how to get health insurance coverage and how to navigate work and cancer are probably at the top of the list. We frequently get questions about those topics, and often because there aren't a lot of other voices talking about that information in the cancer community and how the law is changing both around our healthcare system and around employment rights. And so staying on top of that, people know that they can come to us for the most up-to-date information.
And so I understand, especially, even during our typical, pre-COVID environment, that health insurance and work questions would be incredibly common. We get those questions as well. We often refer the folks that call us to you guys. You're the experts in that. And, cancer care is, complex enough. And now during the coronavirus, it's really brought on a whole new world of challenges. It's exposed a lot of gaps in our system and a lot of the inequities that exist. We recently had our Hill Week, where our advocates had meetings with members of Congress to talk about what our legislative priorities for cancer patients are. And that included asking Congress to expand paid leave to include individuals with cancer. Our last podcast episode actually focused on a really powerful story from one of our advocates. She works at a children's museum. And as that museum now plans to reopen, she's put in a really difficult position of having to choose between her health and her job and her income. And I know both of you have been really engaged on the issue of expanding paid leave. And, you recently presented at a congressional hearing on the issue. I guess, gosh, that was probably 2 months ago now, but it feels like a million years ago. So can you talk about why it's important that cancer survivors are included in paid leave during the pandemic? Monica, do you want to take that one?
Well, I'll certainly start off. And I think it's important to recognize that the concept of paid leave is not new or unique. So other countries have these protections, as well as many states in this country have those protections. But there's little consistency across the US, and frankly, millions of Americans really aren't protected. But what is unique about the situation we're currently in with the COVID-19 global pandemic is that we can't just be looking at protecting the individuals who have the serious medical condition. We also have to be considering their caregivers due to the highly contagious nature of this virus. So I think that it is important to recognize that even though we have some existing rights and protections, there are gaps in those protections. And so when we talk about the ADA and the ability for reasonable accommodations, that's only going to protect individuals who have the serious medical condition, not caregivers. Also, for some people who work for smaller businesses, they might not have access to the ADA. Similarly with the FMLA, which is unpaid leave, although it's job protected and health insurance protected, it begs the question, what are people going to do for their financial health during that time? So I think that it's important to recognize that we certainly do have existing protections, but this virus is so unique and it's really highlighting the gaps in the existing protections.
I would just say, on top of the laws that we had prior to the pandemic, Congress did step in and quickly in March and April pass some additional pieces of legislation that in some really limited circumstances might also be helpful to someone with a cancer diagnosis, that's really only in the case of where someone also has minor children at home. So Congress passed paid FMLA leave, but that only applies to someone who has to care for a minor child whose school or place of childcare has closed. And so there are a lot of opportunities where our elected officials can actually do a little bit more to make sure that people are protected and aren't falling through the gaps. I actually spoke with someone yesterday who is a nurse and actually had a cancer diagnosis and just completed treatment and now has been diagnosed with COVID. And so she's not allowed to work. She has to quarantine, but she works for a staffing agency and under a contract. And both the staffing agency and the hospital are large enough where they actually don't have to provide paid sick leave or paid FMLA leave under the new pandemic related laws. So she can't file for unemployment because she's still employed under that contract, but she can't work and she has no income coming in. So it's a perfect example of how, while there are laws, she is falling through the cracks because none of those laws are providing protection to her. And I don't think that she's alone. I think there are other people who are falling through the cracks too, and we could do more to help people.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're hearing that as well. I mean, we get calls, it's really increased during this time from folks who are, losing their jobs and their insurance. And for a cancer patient or cancer survivor, that's, especially terrifying. And you mentioned, that the expanding of the paid leave policy is, really critical. And that's something that we are excited to see in the recent House package. I think that's called the HEROES package. The Senate is now considering, what their package is going to look like. And I'm curious what you guys think are other, key pieces that would really help specifically cancer survivors during the COVID pandemic as Congress, deliberates on like what the next package is going to look like and what resources there are going to be for people.
I mean, there's certainly lots of things that could be helpful, and there are things that we are proponents of even prior to the current pandemic situation. But one thing that has become an issue in the last couple of weeks has been the fact that states who have marketplaces run by HHS didn't reopen their enrollment period like many of states who do run their own marketplaces did. And those are also many states that didn't expand Medicaid access. And so there are some people who are uninsured in those states that could have had access or could gain access if an open enrollment period were to be created right now. So that's just one example of something that would be helpful.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Monica. And could you elaborate on some of the health insurance issues that patients are experiencing right now through COVID and what you're kind of, hearing from patients and then what we can expect to see in the future?
Well, one of the biggest concerns I think that people have right now is how to keep health insurance coverage if they've lost health insurance through their employer. So we know right now that more than 45 million people have filed for unemployment benefits since March and the pandemic began. And so approximately 50% of people in the United States get their health insurance coverage through an employer. So that's potentially a lot of people who need to know what their health insurance options are. And at Triage Cancer, we are providing additional resources to make sure people understand the variety of options that they have available so they can pick the one that is best for them, that has the lowest out-of-pocket costs, which is critical when we're talking about the high cost of a serious medical condition like a cancer diagnosis. And we know that people might be getting information about COBRA or a state COBRA law from their employer, but we want them to know that's not their only option. And if COBRA is too expensive for them, that they can actually look at the marketplace for other types of health insurance coverage through a special enrollment period, or be looking at other types of health insurance options and then comparing all of the options available before making a decision.
And this is Monica. I just wanted to chime in on that in addition to the information that Joanna mentioned about somebody's options, we also have information about how somebody can go about making the choice between their various options, including recorded webinars and a short animated video, and one of our quick guides, which is a downloadable handout that someone can read through to understand how they go about making those choices. Because we frequently joke in the office that these are things that we all should have been taught in high school, like how to pick a health insurance plan, but we aren't ever. And usually we don't ever learn how to do that until we're in a crisis situation and we're forced to.
Right. And especially now when, there have been so many attacks on the Affordable Care Act, which has helped millions of people. It makes me think of the work that, I think both of our organizations had done on junk plans, or what are, really known as the short-term limited duration plans, which I think is always such an oxymoron, short-term limited duration. Anyway, but, it's not, it's being able to navigate the options, but knowing too, like that while that might be a cheap option, that's not going to provide someone with any of the items that they need. Like it's not going to cover prescription drugs, not going to cover ER visits and stuff like that. Can you talk about, the junk plans or the other options out there that, can be really confusing for patients?
I think that most people don't realize how game-changing the Affordable Care Act was for healthcare consumers across the board, not just for people who don't have health insurance, but for everybody, whether you get coverage through an employer or Medicare or Medicaid or an individual plan. The ACA provided consumer protections in some way, shape, or form for everyone. And those consumer protections we've now gotten pretty used to 10 years into the Affordable Care Act, like not being denied health insurance coverage, or not facing pre-existing condition exclusion periods, or not facing annual or lifetime limits on benefits. Those were all things that really contributed to the bankruptcy statistics for all the people that were having to file bankruptcy because of their medical debt. And so when we started to see things like short-term health insurance plans be made more available to people, it just created more confusion in the marketplace. Those short-term plans don't have to comply with those consumer protections, which is one thing if you want to choose to buy a short-term health insurance plan because it's cheaper and you're making an educated decision to do that. But that's not what we're seeing. We're seeing these short-term health insurance plans be sold across the board and people buying them because they're cheaper, but having no understanding that they're not going to cover things like prescription drugs or even chemotherapy. Monica and I will get calls from healthcare professionals saying, we have a patient who their policy doesn't cover chemotherapy. And Monica and I will look at each other and say, well, that's not possible. They have to cover chemotherapy. And then we sit back and we think about it. And then we realize they probably have one of those short-term health insurance plans. So we're worried that consumers are already trying to navigate a complicated healthcare system. And now there are these other products available or more widely available that are deceptive. And we want consumers to know what they're buying.
Right. And that reminds me, that although this is such an extremely difficult time for so many, throughout the last few months, Shelley, our CEO, at the end of every webinar and podcast, and even through our meetings, like we just are really trying to end on a positive note and talk about, what the silver linings are through all of this. And I think that you kind of just hit on that, in that maybe this is, exposing a lot of the gaps and inequities in our system, and maybe will hopefully give us a chance to address those so that they don't feel bamboozled through this process when they're talking about health care. And we're talking about, cancer patients who, deserve to get the best care possible when they need it. And they shouldn't have to worry about losing their jobs and then not being able to get their treatment. It's just devastating. So, what I would be curious to hear, like, what are some of the other, what's a silver lining that you see through all of this, and how this might be an opportunity for change?
I don't know that I can say that this is a total silver lining, but I do think that unfortunately, the challenges of our healthcare system have been highlighted by the pandemic. And I think the silver lining part of that is that more people are aware of the challenges of our healthcare system. I'm hoping that more people realize that there are solutions and there are solutions being proposed, but nothing has been implemented yet. And we really have to rely on our elected officials to move some of those proposals forward. I think that what I find to be the challenge is that we are also under this shadow of the potential for the Affordable Care Act to be struck down by the Supreme Court as unconstitutional. So that pending court case could seriously change our entire healthcare system. And we don't exactly know what that's going to look like because we've had 10 years of that law being implemented at the federal and state level. And it touches almost every area of our healthcare system. And so it's hard to talk about proposals when we don't know what that court case is going to look like. And we're unlikely to see a resolution in that court case before the end of the year.
Right. And that uncertainty just adds to the chaos and the struggles, I think, for health insurance in general. Monica, do you want to talk about any silver linings that you see through all of this?
Yeah, I mean, there's two actually that I want to mention. I think
All right.
one of the silver linings for me personally is that we've been forced to figure out how to better provide our educational events at Triage Cancer virtually. And although it's never going to take the place of in-person events and that human interaction that's so important at our in-person events, I do love that we are on every event that we host now, we are literally reaching every corner of this country. And I think it's really just a great opportunity to recognize that, hey, technology, while I think we're all a little bit sick of it at this point, can actually be really helpful in disseminating information. So that's my first silver lining. But on more of a policy note, I think what's really interesting is to see how certain states are responding to these gaps, because history has shown us that oftentimes federal progress or legislative progress on the federal level is often started at the state level. So what states are doing can sometimes trickle up to a federal proposal. And so I think there's some really interesting and exciting things that states are doing that I hope sooner rather than later will trickle up. So things like making sure that more employees have access to job protected leave, making sure that paid family leave is in existence, understanding that people above 400% of the federal poverty level might need help buying health insurance in their state. So those are just some examples, but I am hopeful that the federal legislatures will look at what the states are doing and use that information to craft their own policies.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for that, Monica. And, like you said, I hope that we see some of these great solutions that are proposed at the state level, can move forward so that they can help everyone. And, in CCS, we're here to help our advocates talk with their members of Congress and help push that forward so that we can help all cancer survivors that have been impacted during this difficult time. And you talked about the great, virtual resources that you guys have. Can you, share with our listeners where they can go to access those great resources that you all have?
If someone visits triagecancer.org, they will find resources that are specific to their state or a topic. We also host, as Monica mentioned, a separate website called cancerfinances.org that provides education on how to navigate finances after a cancer diagnosis.
Wonderful. I just want to thank you both so much for not only joining us today to talk about these important issues, but also for the incredible work that you all do, to make sure that cancer patients and their families and their care teams have all the information they need to get the best care. And so we look forward to continuing to work with you guys, and we're so grateful for your dedication and your work.
We're looking forward to working with you too. Thank you for having us.
Thanks, guys.
The National Coalition for Cancer Survivorship advocates for quality cancer care for everyone touched by cancer. Founded by and for cancer survivors, NCCS defines someone as a cancer survivor from the time of diagnosis and represents the millions of Americans who share a common experience, living with, through, and beyond a cancer diagnosis. In Cancer Convos, NCCS talks with survivors, advocates, caregivers, providers, and health policy experts about survivorship advocacy and public policy. For more information about NCCS, visit our website at canceradvocacy.org.